All right, thank you everybody. Welcome back from lunch. So my name is Ryan, and I work at a company called Auth0, like Lee mentioned. And we aim to make it really simple for you to solve the authentication, authorization, and identity piece in your app. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about how we can maybe think about handling auth, kind of authorization, authentication in general, within GraphQL. a topic that is widely requested, but one that there's a lot of different options about and a lot of various paths that you could take. I'd like to give you a little bit of a glimpse into what you can do or what some of those options are. So like I mentioned, my name is Ryan. I'm a Google developer expert, but also a developer advocate at Auth0. I also teach a lot. So I teach at angularcast.io. For better or worse, I'm still doing a lot of Angular. I know this is kind of a React crowd this week, but I'm still doing a lot of Angular. And I also am starting up with my pal Lucas Rubelkey, GraphQLWorkshops.com. So we are going to aim to take teams from kind of beginner level GraphQL through to production ready. And that's going to cover kind of the basics all the way through to some advanced topics. So at Auth0, we are really jazzed about GraphQL. I don't need to kind of convince you about the benefits of it. Everybody here, it seems, knows why it's beneficial to use in your application. And we've seen those benefits in this tool that we've got in-house, this tool called Phoenix. So at Auth0, we're growing really quickly. There's a lot of new employees week after week who are joining up. And what we found is that it takes a lot of effort for these new employees to get provisioned with all the resources they need to do their job. So a new employee might need access to our GitHub organization or our NPM org. And instead of going and trying to find the person who's got credentials to give somebody access to these things, we said, you know what, we need to make this simpler. So what we did is we came up with this internal tool called Phoenix, which automates this all. And so basically what happens is you go into Slack and you say, hey, Phoenix, I need to get access to whatever. So in this case, this is me getting access to our NPM org. And I said, I need to get access as an administrator there. And so what Phoenix does is it goes and it pings your manager and it tells them that you want to get access, and then your manager is able to provision you automatically. So this really helps to smooth everything out. It makes it much simpler to do provisioning. Now, when we were thinking about provisioning, we're thinking, you know, provisioning is really, at the core of it, all about permissions. So if you are a new employee, you need to first have some kind of permission to be able to ask for permissions to something else. So you know, maybe you're a single channel guest in Slack who somehow got wind that there's this Phoenix thing. We need to make sure that you aren't that single channel guest, that you actually have authorization to ask for something. And then conversely, if you're a manager, you need to have the appropriate permissions level to grant those provisioning, that provisioning to whoever's asking for it. So at the core of it, this provisioning tool that we've created has a lot to do with permissions. So we said, okay, we're going to do this in GraphQL, and we have done it in GraphQL. It's been excellent. But we need to think about authentication and authorization in GraphQL. So, okay, we're an authentication company. Surely we can figure this out. So we did as any subject matter expert does. We went to Stack Overflow, and what we saw at Stack Overflow was something that we weren't too excited about. We saw something like this. How do you do authentication and authorization in GraphQL? And this is fake, by the way. I just made that up. But what you'll find when you ask around the community is, you handle it any way you like. However you're doing auth in your typical stack, just try to translate that to GraphQL. But this makes a lot of people feel a little bit like this. They say, okay, well, that's not really the answer that I'm looking for. I really want to know how to do this. The problem is that GraphQL doesn't have an opinion, really, about authentication. It doesn't prescribe any one way to do it. And at the end of the day, that's not terribly helpful, but it's a reality of the spec. The spec is, it doesn't make any prescription on that because it leaves it up to you, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, we want to know how to figure this out. So what I'd like to do today is look at two ways that we might think about this. Two things that we can do to kind of get going with auth in our GraphQL APIs. So the first one that we'll look at is how we can maybe wrap our resolvers with something that is smart about authentication. The second one is how we would leverage custom directives. So there's a very powerful thing within GraphQL, custom directives. We've seen a bit about that during the summit. We'll take a look at how we might use those to benefit ourselves at our API. So to think about this, let's look at what we kind of need to be mindful of when we're thinking about API auth. So API authentication requires a lot of things, but it requires us to think about a few things, and these are a few of those things. So first of all, is the data that's being requested, is it private or is it public in the first place? Should it be reserved for only those users who have proven that they are who they say they are and who have access to certain things? Or is it public data? Is it wide open to the internet? We also need to ask ourselves, does the request that's coming in contain authentication information in the first place? Does it contain some piece of info that tells our API that the user is authenticated or not? And then finally, is that information, if it does exist, is it valid? So we could spend some time talking about all the ways that you might get a user to prove that they are who they say they are. We could talk about OAuth. We could talk about best practices for username, password storage, that kind of thing. But that's a whole other topic. It's a very broad topic. I'd be happy to chat with you after about those things if you like. But for now, we're just going to stick with kind of the assumption that we've already got some kind of authentication mechanism in place. And at Auth0, we really like JSON Web Tokens. Show of hands, anybody using JSON Web Tokens in their applications? OK, that's great. That's quite a few of us. We really like this. When you authenticate with Auth0, you're going to get a JSON Web Token back. And then you can use that to protect your API, et cetera. So if you don't know a whole lot about JSON Web Tokens yet, feel free to have a look at this site, jwt.io. You can find some info there. All right, so if we take a look back at how we might do authentication with REST, we can see something like this. So we might have some kind of middleware pattern. So if we're using Node, we might set up a middleware that says, OK, let's take the request that's coming in. Let's run some function to see if the user has a piece of authentication information. In this case, maybe the JSON Web Token existing on the authorization header of the request. And if that's all valid, let's send them through to the next function. But if not, let's send back a 401 and basically kick them out. And so the great thing about this when we're doing something in REST is then we can just apply this to any of the routes, any of the endpoints that we want to protect, right? So if we have private data routes, we can just stick that middleware on. If we have a group of them, we can stick it on there. And we can be selective about which endpoints should be protected. So when we start thinking about GraphQL, we might be tempted to say, OK, well, let's maybe take that approach. Let's try to do something similar. The problem is we don't want something like this. We don't want to have our single GraphQL endpoint and then apply that middleware, because we're going to have this kind of all or nothing scenario in this case. So instead, we want to have something that isn't a catch-all solution, isn't going to be all or nothing. We want something that gives us information about that authenticated user, so a piece of data about who it is that's making the request. And from a JSON Web Token, this can come from the payload of the token. And we want also some way to handle authentication errors appropriately. So as was touched on in a previous talk, you might have the case where you're getting back status codes that are only 200s from your GraphQL API, even if something has gone wrong. And quite often, that's the useful case, so that we can just pick up any errors that might exist in our response and use those, but not necessarily rely on 401s or other 400 series errors to tell us that something has gone wrong. All right, so how do we get there? Well, the first thing that we can look at, again, is wrapping our resolvers. So to get to that point, let's think about these kind of two steps to authentication and authorization. So I think about it like this. First, we have to verify that the authentication is good, make sure that the JSON Web Token hasn't expired, make sure that it hasn't been tampered with, which would then invalidate its signature. And then we need to use that, if we know it's valid, to make authorization decisions in our API. So let's start out with this. So this is not the ideal final scenario, but we'll start here, and we'll work along. So we've got this middleware that is kind of following a bit of a similar pattern to what we had before. We've got this JSON Web Token middleware, which just takes a secret key that we provide it, checks the JSON Web Token that comes in against that secret key to make sure everything matches up. And if that is good, then we're going to take the payload from the token and attach it to the request object, to a user object on there. And what's going to happen then is that's going to become available in our resolver context argument. And so the thing we're doing here is we're just stacking these middlewares. So we're first using that jot check middleware, that jot middleware that you see. And then we're going to attach information from the token to the request afterwards. So where this becomes useful is that now when we have a query or mutation or anything, we can take our context and we can grab that user object from it. And so then we might delegate to some model where we take maybe the sub claim. So usually sub is the user ID in a JSON Web Token. We might take that and we might go off and fetch something like articles by that user ID. And so this kind of gets to that whole idea of the viewer kind of pattern, where our responses from our API are relative to whoever it is that's viewing the API at the time. And that viewer pattern becomes available through taking that user ID from the token and then using that to go and get the data. Then we can also add other things in where we can do authorization checks. So there's a few different ways to do authorization in general. You might have a set of roles in your API. So something like admins or managers or like a user role. And those might map to certain sets of permissions that people might have. Alternatively, and what you would get with Auth0 is this concept of scopes. And with a scope, you can get, I would say, a little bit more fine-grained. The way that it usually looks is you would have something like a verb and a noun. So a user can read articles or write comments or whatever the case might be. And then this becomes this kind of bag of scopes that you can sort of dish out to users as needed. Maybe it's based on a role, and so at the time that you're minting your token, you can put any kind of scopes into it that your user might need. And so then, in our resolvers, what happens is we can go and we can check for those scopes. So in this case, if the user has a scope of read articles, then they're good to go. But if not, we're going to do something else. So that's all happening in the resolver, and the problem, I guess, with it is it's going to get a bit repetitive eventually. If we're doing that for every single resolver, it's not going to scale that well. So instead, why don't we take a look at how we can wrap our resolvers. So here's a resolver with a scope check. So basically, we're starting to delegate to this other resolver called check, scope, and resolve. It's going to take the scope that the user has in their JSON Web Token. It's going to take a set of expected scopes, so what we want them to have, perhaps an array. And then we're going to give it some kind of controller, some kind of other thing that's going to do some kind of delegation to our business logic. And then all it becomes is that when we go for articles by author, we just have to pass in the scope that the user has that we know and trust that they have. We're going to pass in what we expect them to have. And then finally, the controller that's going to handle that piece. Now we can reuse this across our API. So I mentioned at the beginning when I was showing this that it wasn't maybe the ideal way to go because we were stacking our middlewares. So the problem is that if you send in a JSON Web Token that is invalid, if it's expired, or if it doesn't contain the proper, or if it's not verifiable, if it's been tampered with or whatnot, you're just going to get a 401 back usually right away because you're using that middleware. So instead, what we can do is we can make our resolver wrappers a little bit smarter. And we can take that verification piece and we can just move it into the resolver. So now instead of having more of an all or nothing thing where we're going to get the token get past that middleware or not, what we've got instead is a verification that's happening right in place. So what you see here is that we're taking in the authorization header that's going to exist on the context. And then we're doing a JWT verification right in place here. So that's the other nice part about this is that instead of relying on like 401 errors or any other sorts of errors that we might get from our middleware, instead what we can do is we can use errors that are more appropriate for our GraphQL API. So you might have used Apollo errors. You can create some kind of authorization error. And if the user doesn't have the appropriate level of authorization, or if something goes wrong with their token, you can just throw one of those errors. And what that's going to give you now is something more like this instead of a 401. So in this case, you can just take that message, you are not authorized, do what you need to with it in your client application. Another approach that we might take, and something that's very interesting that I really like, is the concept of custom directives. So if we want to do something that's not relying solely on these custom resolvers that we've built, we can take a look at this pattern. So it helps answer the question, what if we want to start to limit access to specific fields? What if we want to have the ability to mark off particular fields that a user must have a certain level of authorization to get access to? And with custom directives, we've got that option. Now, you are probably familiar with this if you've taken a look at the directives included with GraphQL. So we can do things where we include a specific field in our client queries based on some condition. Now, we wouldn't use something like this to do any kind of limitation on our return data. And the reason is that we can't trust the client to provide the appropriate Boolean value because they could spoof it easily. We need to be taking that out of their hands and using the information from their authentication/authorization info, which in this case is the JSON Web Token. We need to take something from that and use that to answer this question. So the directive then is going to move into our schema. So what we can do is something that looks like this. We can define some directives. I've got two here. Is authenticated and has scope. Has scope takes an argument, which is an array or a list of strings. And then we can just start tacking these on in places that we need. So in this case, we're saying that to get this query at all, this all articles query, the user needs to be authenticated. And then if the user wants to get at the review comments, the reviewer comments, well, they have to have a particular scope. In this case, they need to be able to read comments. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that we could go about defining custom directives and making them do what we need them to do to make the appropriate authorization checks and everything like that. This is kind of one way you might go about it. There's a lot of code that I've omitted here. There's a lot of stuff that happens. But basically, we've got these two directive resolvers, we'll call them. This is where you would do your authentication logic, like we've seen before in our custom resolver wrappers. And then you would throw errors if that's the case, if the user isn't authenticated. And then once you've got those, you can use the AST and walk down the AST and replace basically any of the resolvers that you see with a directive with this custom directive resolver. So there's a lot of code that goes into that. I've omitted it here for brevity. But if you'd like to take a look at how you might implement that, you can check out this repo. And I think this is really nice. With this pattern, I think we get this clean API. So we get this really nice declarative way of being able to say, OK, this user has to be authenticated, or they have to have a particular scope. And by the way, it doesn't have to be something like has scope. It could be has role. So maybe a user, if you've got a model that's a bit simpler, where you've just got a few roles, you could attach something like has role admin, has role manager, whatever the case may be. The other nice thing we get is this possibility for kind of per field authorization. So we can omit certain fields from being returned if we don't want a user to get access to specific fields. And we've got really nice resolver level authentication checks. So those are the two ways that I thought would be useful to go over. But the truth is there are a lot of ways to do authentication in GraphQL. And there are a lot of different opinions about it, I think, too. So we heard from Tony this morning that they decided to take authentication out of the API layer, leave it in the business layer, and make sure that the API doesn't have a concept of it. But you might choose to do it in your API. And that's a valid choice. Again, GraphQL doesn't make any prescription about how you would handle authentication. There are lots of ways to do it. There are many more than I've shown here. But those are two of the ways that we found work pretty well with GraphQL. So I would recommend that you maybe try a few out. And don't be afraid to kind of mix and match a couple of them. Again, there's no one right way. You've got to do what works best for your business domain. So at this point, I have a slide that isn't showing up. The slide is the one that I showed earlier on. Oh, geez. OK, we'll forget that. The slide was that Stack Overflow screenshot, which basically says, how do you do authentication with GraphQL however you want, basically. So that's where we're back at, really, after taking a little bit of a tour of it. That's just kind of a fact of life, I guess, right now with GraphQL. But I hope that those two methods kind of give you some kind of inspiration to go and try it out and see what works best for your particular application. So if you have any questions about that at all, I am more than happy to chat with you after. I'll be around all day. Yeah, let me know if those work out for you or if something else is more appropriate for your app. So you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Ryan Chenkie. You can get these slides at the bit.ly link and check out GraphQL workshops if you are interested in training. Thank you.